Let's now pick up with a cross that would have been something similar to what Mendel did. Now, all he knew were the genotypes. So in this case, he's looking at plants, and he's got a tall plant and a dwarf plant. Those tall and dwarf are the genotypes. Now over here, what you see is what the genotype is. We now know that because of Mendel, but he didn't. Doing what he did helped us figure this out. All right. Now, if he takes these two parents, which we call the P generation, and he cross-fertilized those, like I showed you in the previous presentation, he then has the children. The children are called the F1 generation. And now what you see is he noticed that all of them were tall. And so the dwarf version disappeared. Now, maybe it disappeared forever. Who knows? He didn't understand how genes worked with each other. And so it looks like all of the children have the same genotype as they do as one of the parents. But now what he does is he self-fertilizes. So we'll take one of these plants and crosses them with itself. And then he has what we might call the grandchildren, the F2 generation. And look what happens. Voila, the dwarf has returned. And so what he realized is that there must be some kind of factor, he didn't call it a gene, for this dwarfness that was lying in these plants, but we didn't see it again because it was masked by the gene for tallness. All right, and so if we now take a look at the genotypes over here, what we now understand is that the tall phenotype here had a genotype of capital T, capital T. What does that mean? When we give a letter designation to a trait, to a gene, we pick it randomly. So this is just about height, but they use T as the abbreviation. So you stick with the T, but to differentiate between what we call the dominant and the recessive, you use uppercase and lowercase. All right. And then when the egg and the sperm were made from this P generation, and then they had their children, what we now know is that the children were all one uppercase, one lowercase t in their genotype. That is because they each got a uppercase T from this parent and a lowercase t from this parent. When you have these two together, it's called heterozygous, as opposed to up here is homozygous. Homozygous just means that on both of my chromosomes, the gene versions or gene alleles are the same. Now, we know that this is an uppercase T for tall. We know that it's dominant because look what happened. When you have an uppercase and a lowercase, all of them wind up being tall. When the dwarf comes back out again, it is because we self-fertilize, and with that, we had children that are homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive. And in this case, because the two recessive genes come together, is the only time that I see the dwarf offspring, then I definitely know, again, that that is the recessive trait. I only see that phenotype when both of my alleles are recessive. Now, to give you a sense of how much work Mendel did on this and other things, this is the flower color we talked about. He looked at some kind of the rough or wrinkled seeds, and you can see here how he documented what color he got in the F and the F1 and F2. And he also looked at how many thousands of plants he evaluated, right? 15,000 dominant, 5,000 recessive plants in all. And So he looked at a lot. This is what science is about. You need numbers behind it, right? You need to be statistically sound. And the ratio that he sees all the time is this 3-to-1. It's not perfect. Sometime a little higher, sometime a little bit lower. But if it's 3-to-1, it is because this is how genes work. All right, so let's just wrap up 3 important ideas that Mendel came up with. He figured that traits or alleles were either dominant or recessive. The dominant variant will show up whether you are heterozygous for that dominant allele or homozygous. And recessive variants mask whatever their protein is masked by the dominant allele. The second idea that he came up with is that these factors that he called them are genes, and that every individual must have 2 genes for that particular feature. And of course, as we described, that those different variants are called alleles. And the last thing that, let me fix this for you, that he figured out was in his law of segregation, that the 2 copies of a gene separate from each other during meiosis as they go from parent to offspring, and that each gamete only carries 1 of those alleles. We've discussed that in the mitosis chapter. Okay, so let's just recap here. The genotype is the genetic composition. What are the genes inside? And for any given trait, right, we're going to have 2 different letters for the letter that your mom gave you, right, and the letter that your dad gave you. So when we see this one, it's homozygous dominant. This is homozygous recessive, and this is called heterozygous. But the 3-to-1 ratio that we saw was in phenotype, right? The phenotype was tall, whether you were homozygous dominant or heterozygous, and only dwarf when you are homozygous recessive. We will pick this up in the next lecture.